There is a peculiar cruelty in the human heart that builds walls where bridges might stand. Men separate themselves by blood, by belief, by the color of the earth beneath their feet, and they call this separation natural, inevitable, the way the world was meant to be ordered. Yet there are moments in the sparse and unforgiving places, in deserts and mountains, where survival depends not on the opinions of distant cities, but on what a man does when no one is watching, when this carefully constructed division falters. The mask of certainty slips. A man looks at a child and sees not a future enemy, but a child, lost and cold and afraid. In those moments, the true architecture of a man's soul is exposed. Not what he believes when the crowd is behind him, but what he does when the only witness is the wind and the stars. This is the story of Jasper Wainwright, a man for whom such a moment came when he was least prepared to meet it. Jasper had spent 20 years bent over rock faces and dried creek beds, his face darkening under the Utah sun until he resembled something carved from the landscape itself. He was 45 years old and had the aspect of someone much older, leaned out by hope deferred, by the endless turning of earth that yielded nothing but dust and the hollow echo of his own labor. His hands were the color of old leather, and they trembled sometimes in the evenings when he stopped working, as though all the years of reaching for something just beyond reach had left permanent marks not just on his skin, but in the very architecture of his nerves. He had claimed a modest prospect in a box canyon east of the Apache Mountains, a place where few men ventured and fewer stayed. This suited him. He spoke to no one because he had become, through the accretion of years, someone whom no one wished to hear from. The canyon had its rhythms. In autumn, the cottonwoods at the canyon's mouth turned to burning gold, their leaves catching the light like coins he would never find. The mornings were sharp and clear, with frost that gripped the ground until midday sun burned it away. At dusk, the canyon's walls turned the color of old wine. It was not a place of beauty, exactly, but of a kind of austere truth. A place where a man knew where he stood, literally and otherwise. His camp occupied a wide alcove 2 miles deeper into the canyon, where the north-facing wall rose sheer for nearly 100 feet, and had weathered back far enough to create a natural shelter. He had built a lean-to against the stone, rough wooden frames lashed with cordage, a covering of canvas stretched tight to turn the rain and the wind. His possessions were few and deliberate. A pickaxe with a handle worn smooth by 20 years of gripping, a mining pan that had taken more disappointment than ore, coils of rope of varying thickness, a saddlebag containing his surveying notes, sketches of rock formations and suspected fault lines, the meticulous record of a man searching for something he could not name. The mule, Deuteronomy, named in a moment of rare humor that now seemed decades distant, stood hobbled in the grassy area where the canyon widened, a beast as lean and purposeful as his master. Their diet was the narrow margin between scarcity and survival. Hardtack that could crack teeth, jerky dried until it resembled leather, whatever trout Jasper could coax from the cold stream using lengths of catgut and hooks fashioned from bent wire. Once a month, he made the long ride to a supply depot at Monticello and returned with flour, coffee, salt, and the knowledge that no one there remembered his name. It was a life stripped to essentials, and he had grown so accustomed to its emptiness that he could no longer distinguish between the loneliness he endured and the loneliness he had chosen. 20 years searching for silver veins that were mostly illusion, mostly the stories told by the light and his own desperation. 20 years in a canyon where the only voice was the wind through the cottonwoods, and the only eyes that met his were the eyes of deer at dawn, cautious and appraising. Jasper discovered the boy on an afternoon in late October, 3 hours before sunset, near the mouth of a narrow side canyon where the rock formations rose in stacked fins like broken teeth. He had been searching for a fault line he thought he'd glimpsed weeks before, when the light fell at a particular angle. Instead, behind a boulder, wedged in a space barely large enough to hold him, was a child no more than 8 years old. The boy was Apache. This much was evident from the deerskin tunic he wore, from the single beaded cord around his left wrist, from the moccasins worn thin at the heels from travel. His dark hair hung just below his ears. His eyes were open but unfocused, the way an animal's eyes look when shock has suspended fear. He was thin enough that Jasper could count his ribs through the fabric of his tunic, and he was shaking, not from cold, though the evening was growing cold, but from something deeper, something that looked like the aftermath of panic. Jasper had not spoken to another human being in 6 months. He had forgotten, in that span, how to arrange his face into something that might not appear threatening. He simply stood there, his pickaxe still in his hand, staring at the boy, and the boy stared back at him with eyes that seemed to be asking, in the moments before death, whether death would be quick. The boy's hand moved toward a knife, a small blade, barely more than a razor, but the motion was less aggressive than desperate. It was the gesture of something cornered, preparing for an end it already knew was coming. "I'm not going to hurt you," Jasper said, and was startled by the roughness of his own voice, the way the words came out like stones dragged across gravel. He set the pickaxe down slowly and sat on his heels, making himself smaller. "You're lost," he said, not a question. The boy made no response, but his eyes tracked Jasper's movements with the intensity of a creature waiting for the moment to run. What came next was neither dramatic nor complex. Jasper simply sat with the boy in silence, his back against the rock, and waited. He waited through the hour when the sun touched the canyon rim. He waited through the first stars. He waited while the boy gradually, incrementally lowered the knife. Around dusk, when the trembling had subsided to small, periodic shudders, Jasper reached into his pocket and withdrew a piece of dried apple he had been saving. He ate half of it, slowly, deliberately, and then set the other half on the ground between them. The boy watched it more carefully than he watched Jasper. When hunger finally overwhelmed caution, he reached forward and took it. In the days that followed, Jasper learned what little the boy could communicate through gestures and the few words that seemed universal to all living things in fear and exhaustion. There had been a cavalry engagement, 3 days' ride north. The boy had been with a hunting party, small and scattered, when the soldiers came. His band, he made gestures that suggested perhaps 20 or 30, had fled in different directions. He had become separated, unable to locate them, moving south in the general direction he thought their winter camp lay. He had no food. He was afraid. This much Jasper understood. Whether the boy understood who Jasper was, what he was doing, seemed irrelevant. The child had made a calculus that was simple and clear. This man with the weathered face and the quiet voice was not, in this moment, something to fear. That was enough. It was on the morning of the second day, as Jasper was preparing to move the camp and gather supplies for travel, that Heck Pharaoh appeared on the canyon rim. Heck was a prospector like Jasper, though of a different species. A man who still carried optimism in his frame, whose eyes still held the shine of the possible. He rode a mule that was marginally better fed than Deuteronomy, and he had the easy manner of someone for whom solitude was temporary, a phase to be endured rather than inhabited. Jasper, Heck called from the rim, the name echoing off the canyon walls. He did not descend immediately, but sat there, observing the scene below. The boy near the fire, Jasper's hastily packed belongings, the atmosphere of imminent departure. When Heck finally picked his way down the rocky path, his expression had hardened into something more businesslike. "That's Apache," he said, not as a question, but as an observation, the way one might note that the weather was changing. "Yes," Jasper said. "You know there's a patrol working the territory? I saw them 2 days north, moving south, and there's talk of bounty, $50 for any of them brought in alive. More if you bring in a group." Heck moved closer, his voice taking on the tone of someone offering practical advice, not malice. "You could turn this one in, claim the money. Lord knows we could all use it. The boy wouldn't suffer much. He's young. He'd adapt, probably wind up on some reservation or other. Or you could leave him at Monticello, let the mission sort it out. Either way, you separate yourself from this mess. Cavalry patrols don't ask a man many questions when he's done the right thing." Jasper said nothing. He continued gathering the supplies he had laid out: bedrolls, water skins, dried meat wrapped in cloth. "Your funeral," Heck said, after a moment of watching this silence unfold. "But I'm telling you, Jasper, the world doesn't reward men for going sideways with the natural order of things. You're making yourself a complication that will end you." He paused, perhaps expecting some response, and when none came, he wheeled his mule back toward the rim. "If they catch you out there with him, don't come back this way expecting shelter. I've got a life to keep." Jasper watched him go and felt no anger, no judgment. Heck was right in the way that practical men were right. The world did not reward such choices. But Jasper understood now that he was making the choice not because it was wise or sustainable, but because it was the only choice that would allow him to continue looking at his own reflection without flinching. Jasper had 3 choices, as he saw it, and all of them felt like losses. He could turn the boy over to the cavalry patrol. He knew they were searching, could see their dust sometimes on distant ridges, and absolve himself of responsibility. He knew what happened to Apache prisoners, especially children. The second choice was to leave the boy at one of the settlements, at Fort Abajo or Monticello, where perhaps a mission might take him, educate him out of himself, make him useful to civilization. The third choice was the one that made no sense at all. It was the one he eventually chose. He would take the boy back to his people. This decision, when Jasper examined it in the cold hours before dawn, seemed to violate something fundamental about how men were supposed to behave toward each other. It was impractical. It was risky. It was, by the standards of every settlement and soldier and white man with a claim to land in the territory, a profound act of betrayal. And yet there was, underneath all of this reasoning, something he could not articulate, some bone-deep knowledge that to do anything else would be to hollow himself out completely, to become finally and irredeemably the empty thing he had been constructing himself into for 2 decades. They left at dawn the next morning, Jasper on his mule and the boy on an old pony Jasper owned, but had not ridden in years. They traveled in broad daylight, moving north and slightly east, back toward the mountains where cavalry patrols were less common and where, according to the vague directions the boy could provide through gesture and point, His people had spoken of a winter place, a canyon with good water and shelter from the wind. For the first 2 days, the boy ate and drank when offered, and otherwise said nothing. His wariness remained intact, but it had changed in character. He was no longer afraid of Jasper, Jasper thought, but afraid of what his absence meant, afraid of the future that might not include his family, afraid of hope itself because hope was the most dangerous thing a lost child could feel. On the 3rd day, as they approached the foothills where the piñón pines began to appear, something shifted. The boy began to watch the landscape more carefully, his head turning, his body leaning forward on the pony. He was looking for landmarks. He knew where he was, or was beginning to remember. The canyon walls, the shape of the peaks against the sky, these were language to him, readable as any map. Over the next hours, the boy began to show Jasper things. He pointed to roots growing near the base of an old juniper, roots that were edible, bitter, but sustaining. He showed Jasper how to read the dust on the trail, the barely visible sign of recent passage, a skill that took Jasper years of prospecting to develop, and which the boy seemed to know from birth. He demonstrated which water was safe, a small seep in a rocky outcrop that would have taken Jasper an hour to locate, by the particular song of the birds that gathered there. And then, as they sat by the fire that evening, the boy laughed. It was a small sound, uncertain, as though he was testing whether laughter was still allowed, still possible in this world of separation and traveling. It was the sound of a child, and it broke something open in Jasper's chest that he had sealed off a long time ago. He reached over and placed his hand on the boy's head, and the child did not flinch. They sat that way while the fire burned down, and later, as the stars emerged, the boy took a stick and drew in the dirt between them, a line that curved like a river, then a shape that might have been mountains, and then, with great care, what looked like the profile of a horse. He tapped the drawing and spoke, not in English, not in the few Apache words Jasper knew, but in a voice that carried all the clarity of location, of home, of a place that existed not as memory, but as certainty, a place that was calling him. And this was when Jasper first felt the true weight of what he was doing. He had not considered, with any seriousness, what would happen if they were discovered. The cavalry would not ask questions of a man traveling with an Apache child. The prospectors and settlers, the men who had moved into the territory with the assumption that it was empty because they chose to empty it, would see him as a collaborator, a traitor to his own kind. There was a bounty. Jasper had heard this in the few settlements he visited, for any Apache brought in alive. The temptation would be immense for men living on knife edges, men barely surviving. To turn in an old prospector and a child for a few $100s would not seem like betrayal to them. It would seem like pragmatism. Subscribe to Western Hearts and Honor so you never miss the next story. There are more like this one waiting. In the cold before dawn on the 4th day, Jasper found himself seized by doubt that had the quality of sickness. He sat by the small fire they allowed themselves and watched the boy sleep, the child's face peaceful in a way it had not been since Jasper found him. The boy trusted him now. He slept without the rigid tension of before, and this trust was the thing that might kill them both. What had he done? What right had he to make this choice for a child, to place them both in the path of cavalry patrols and vengeful settlers? There was a version of this story in which an old prospector simply found a lost boy, gave him food and water, pointed him in the direction of his people, and considered his obligation complete. That was the practical thing, the survivable thing. Instead, he had embedded himself in the boy's fate, and the boy in his, and they were now bound together in a way that could only end in profound loss. But he did not turn back. In the morning, he saddled the mule and saddled the pony again, and they rode on. On the fourth day, in the hour after mid-morning, they came to a ridge that ran north to south, and as they were crossing it, the boy suddenly tensed. He made a sound, urgent, soft, and pointed. Below them, perhaps a mile distant, moved a line of riders. Jasper could see the color of their uniforms before he could see their faces, could see the shine of metalwork, the precise formation of cavalry moving with purpose. There were 4 of them, maybe 5. Jasper wheeled the mule sharply and gestured to the boy, and without hesitation, which itself spoke to a bond that had grown between them, the child turned his pony. They picked their way quickly but carefully into a dry wash that cut through the landscape, a cut perhaps 10 feet deep with crumbling walls of red soil and stone. Jasper dismounted and pulled the boy down, and they crouched there in the dust as the sound of the patrol grew louder. Hooves on hard ground, the creak of saddle leather, the clink of equipment, voices thin and carried on the wind, speaking English in the sharp, abbreviated tones of military men. "Nothing out here. Keep moving." He said they were heading toward the northern canyons. "The boy's likely dead by now anyway." The voices moved along the ridgeline above them, seemed to hang there for an agonizing moment, and then began to fade. Jasper and the boy remained motionless, breathing the dust, until the sound of the patrol was gone entirely, and there was only the wind and the distant call of a raven. When Jasper finally looked down at the boy's face, he saw something that had not been there before. A recognition, a knowledge that this man who had found him in a canyon and offered him dried apple was willing to hide with him, to place himself in the path of the soldiers, to choose the boy's safety over his own. It was written in the child's eyes. This was not rescue. This was something deeper, something that had its own name in languages Jasper would never speak. The 5th day brought them to a wide canyon with a permanent stream, fresh cottonwoods, and the remnants of recent camps. The boy became animated, pointing insistently ahead, making sounds that Jasper understood were not words, but recognition. This was near. This was close. This was the place. Jasper could also see the signs that told him they were not alone. The smoke of a distant camp, thin against the blue. The sound of voices carrying down the canyon on the cold wind. He could not tell if they were Apache or cavalry, and the not knowing made every nerve in him feel exposed, raw. They moved more slowly now, and Jasper kept the boy close, moving perpendicular to the canyon to avoid the camps until he could determine what he was riding toward. The landscape was beautiful in the stark way of high desert. The cottonwoods were still golden, caught in that moment before winter stripped them bare. The stone was rust and cream and deep red, layered like memory, each stratum a different story. The sky was absurdly blue, and the light, the afternoon light of autumn in the high country, was the color of honey. Near dusk, they found a high point above the main canyon, a place where the rocks provided cover and the sight lines extended for miles. Jasper helped the boy down and told him, through gestures and the few Apache words he had learned, to wait, stay, sleep. At the first light, if nothing came, they would go to the canyon floor and announce themselves. The boy did not like this. His anxiety was visible in the way his small hands fisted in his tunic, but he obeyed. Jasper did not sleep. He sat watching the stars and thinking about the strange arithmetic of sacrifice, about whether there was any meaningful difference between dying for something and living in diminishment because you could not find the courage to die for it. He thought about the prospector he had been, the man bent over rocks, the man who had spent 20 years looking for something outside himself because looking inside was unbearable. That man was gone, or was dying, and Jasper did not know who would take his place. At first light, the boy woke and knew immediately that something had changed. He sat up, his entire body suddenly alert, and made a soft sound, not quite a word, not quite a call, but something in between, something that sounded like home. Jasper looked out across the canyon and saw them. They came from the north, emerging from the distant reaches where the canyon twisted out of sight. Riders, a long line of them, moving in formation that suggested neither panic nor casual travel, but something deliberate, purposeful. They were Apache. This much Jasper could tell from the way they sat their horses, from the rhythm of their movement, from the aspect of a people moving through territory they owned in ways that went beyond property into something rooted in blood and bone. The riders came on. There were 30 of them, perhaps more. At their head rode a man, older, with hair showing gray, carrying himself in a way that made Jasper understand he was looking at a leader, a man for whom command had become as natural as breathing. Behind the leader rode younger warriors, some with rifles, some with bows, all of them watchful in the way of men who had been hunted and who hunted in return. For a long moment, nothing happened but the sound of hooves on stone, the creak of saddles, the soft percussion of horses moving across the canyon floor. The riders below seemed neither to have seen Jasper and the boy, nor to have failed to see them. There was simply a quality of intention in the way they moved, as though they were riding towards something they already knew was there. Jasper stood, his hands visible and empty. The boy stood beside him, small and suddenly smaller, and made that sound again, that call that was half cry and half recognition. It carried across the rocks and down into the canyon with a clarity that seemed to freeze everything for a moment. The lead rider raised his hand, and the line of horsemen slowed. They came to a halt at a distance of perhaps 50 yards, the leader regarding Jasper with an expression that was neither hostile nor welcoming, but something more complex, a kind of assessment, a reading of something written in the air between them. There was silence. The wind moved through the canyon, carrying the scent of sage and horse and dust. The boy was trembling again, but this time with an electricity that was not quite fear and not quite joy, but a strange admixture of both. The leader dismounted slowly. He was taller than he had seemed on a horseback, and he moved with a deliberation that made every action a statement. He approached to within a few yards and stopped. He looked at the boy, and something shifted in his face, not exactly a smile, but a recognition, a confirmation of something hoped for and feared would not be found. He spoke to the boy in Apache, words that Jasper could not understand. The boy responded, his voice high and thin and urgent, and the leader listened without interruption, his eyes never leaving the child's face. As the old man listened, the line of riders moved forward slowly, and Jasper could now see the detail of them. Horses of varying colors, some marked with paint, their flanks and necks thick with muscle, ready for the journey ahead. Some of the younger warriors carried rifles across their laps. Others had bows lashed to their saddles. All of them sat with a stillness that was absolute, a patience born of knowing how to wait for what mattered. And then one of the riders, a woman Jasper saw, with gray threading through her long black hair, dismounted without being told. She approached the old man and the boy, and when she reached them, her hands went to her face, her fingers tracing the contours of the child's features, as though she needed to verify his existence through touch. She pulled him against her, holding him with a force that spoke of months of not holding, of nights spent wondering if this exact moment would ever arrive. She spoke his name, or what Jasper understood to be his name, over and over, a litany that was prayer and grief and relief all at once. Other riders began to move as well, and Jasper understood that this reuniting was not something to be observed, but something to be witnessed, something sacred in its ordinariness. An old man's hand on a child's head, a woman's arms around a small body, the simple absolute love that required no language to translate. Then the leader turned to Jasper. He was silent for a long time, and Jasper understood that this silence was important, that in this silence a judgment was being rendered, a story was being read, a decision was being made that would determine whether Jasper walked away from this moment alive or did not walk away from it at all. "You brought my grandson to us." The words were in English, and they were spoken with the accent of someone who had learned the language the way one learns an enemy's tactics, thoroughly, perfectly, without love. "You brought him from great distance." "Yes," Jasper said. There was nothing else to say. Lying now would be pointless and insulting. "Why?" Jasper opened his mouth and found that the answer was not something he could locate in language. The explanation that came out was simpler and more true than any of his reasoning. "He was lost. I brought him home." The old man, for the leader was old, Jasper could see that now, old in the way of men who had carried the weight of their people, whose faces had been carved by decision and consequence, nodded slowly. He reached up and placed his hand on the boy's head, his weathered fingers spreading across the child's dark hair, and held it there for a moment that seemed to extend beyond time, a moment in which something was being passed between them, some understanding that was not exactly forgiveness, but was its own kind of grace. He turned back to Jasper. "Your claim in the canyon to the south. You will not be troubled there. The water comes from our land, but it comes also to your land, and a man who brings a child home deserves water to live. The canyon to the east, where the silver runs in the rock. You should know where it is. My people have known for many generations. We will tell you. The soldiers will not find you there, and we will protect what you find. This is what your kindness is worth." Jasper felt something in his chest loosen, a fist that had been clenched for decades opening slowly. "I don't need payment," he said, and meant it. "It is not payment," the old man said. "It is relationship. Before this day, you were a man alone. After this day, you are a man known to us. The difference is larger than you understand." The boy suddenly moved, running forward and wrapping his small arms around Jasper's leg, his face pressed against the prospector's worn trousers, his whole body shaking with a grief that was not quite grief, and a joy that was not quite joy, but some compound emotion that had no name in any language. Jasper placed his hand on the child's head, mirroring the gesture the old man had made, and felt the weight of it, the simple, profound weight of a child held. The old man raised his hand, and the riders moved forward slowly. They did not encircle Jasper and the boy, but rather seemed to close around them gently, a formation that was not quite capture and not quite welcome, but perhaps something new. A third thing that Jasper had no words for. The boy released Jasper and was lifted onto one of the horses by a young warrior, the child's eyes still fixed on the prospector's face as the horse was turned back toward the canyon. The line of riders moved away, back the way they had come, and Jasper watched them go, the dust they raised, the sound of their passage fading, the boy's small hand raised in a gesture that was neither wave nor salute, but something simpler, something final. When they were gone, when the canyon was empty again, except for the wind and the stones, and the light fading toward dusk, Jasper stood for a long time without moving. The autumn sun was warm on his face. The golden cottonwoods were turning to ash gray, and then to shadow. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the voices of the riders, still audible, still present, but no longer visible, no longer part of the world he could touch. He turned back toward the south, toward his camp, his claim, his decades of searching. But he was a different man now, a man who had been read by another man and found not entirely wanting. A man who knew now what it felt like to mean something outside himself. A man who would look at the rock faces and the creek beds not with the hunger of the years before, but with a strange new peace, knowing that what he found or did not find in the ground was less important than what he had chosen, once, when the choosing mattered most. 6 months later, in the spring, a delegation came to his camp. The canyon had transformed in the interval. The cottonwoods were leafing out in a green so pure it seemed almost impossible, a renewal after months of winter austerity. The creek ran high and fast with snowmelt. Its voice changed from the quiet whisper of autumn to something more insistent, more alive. 3 warriors and the old man rode into camp on horses that moved with the ease of animals who had covered many miles and would cover many more. The old man dismounted with care, moving the way of men who had earned the wisdom of caution about their bodies. He carried with him, on pack horses, gifts that spoke of relationship, dried meat from the hunt, beautiful worked leather, tools of their own making. But more importantly, he carried knowledge. They showed Jasper a canyon to the east, a canyon he had searched past dozens of times, its marker stones worn and its significance invisible to his eye. And in that canyon, the silver ran in the rock exactly as the old man had said. Broad veins, substantial, the kind of strike that would have driven lesser men to madness with its beauty. Jasper began to work it, not with the desperation of the former years, but with something steadier, something that felt like purpose in the truest sense, like work that meant something beyond the working of it. Other prospectors began to notice. Word traveled among the small, scattered communities of claim jumpers and dreamers that something was happening in the eastern canyons, that silver was being pulled from the ground in quantities that suggested not luck, but knowledge, as though someone had been given a map written in stone and blood. They asked Jasper how he had found it. He said nothing. The canyon kept its silence, and so did he, understanding that some agreements were not meant to be spoken, only honored. In the years that followed, Jasper Wainwright became a figure known throughout the territory, a prospector who lived unmolested in hostile country, who traded fairly with the tribes and was left alone by the cavalry, who had somehow carved out a strange peace in a time when peace seemed impossible. The stories grew, as such stories do, but the heart of them remained. Once, when it mattered, a solitary man had looked at another man's lost child and chosen kinship over survival, and found that choosing kinship was the only way to survive that meant anything. If this story stayed with you, leave your like, subscribe to Western Hearts in Honor, and tell us in the comments, would you have made the same choice? The Old West was full of moments like this one. Moments where an ordinary person had to decide who they actually were when it mattered. We'll be back with more of those stories, the ones the history books almost forgot to keep.